Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Dr. David Renshaw swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, the ice cubes clinking against the sides as he sat in the corner of his own living room. The $12 million Dallas estate, which he'd purchased with cash 3 years ago, buzzed with the voices of family members who filled the space with laughter that didn't include him. David took another sip, letting the whiskey burn down his throat. He'd performed a 12-hour mitral valve replacement surgery earlier that day, saved a man's life. Yet here he sat a stranger in his own home. His eyes tracked Betty across the room. His wife of 19 years moved with practiced grace, her blonde hair falling just below her shoulders, her black cocktail dress hugging curves that still turned heads. 42 heads of medical departments at Dallas Memorial had asked him how he'd managed to marry someone so far out of his league. The answer was simple. He'd worked for it. Worked through medical school, through 60-hour residency weeks, through building his practice until he became the most sought-after cardiothoracic surgeon in Texas. But right now, Betty wasn't looking at him. She hadn't all evening. Instead, she hovered near his younger brother, Tom, the investment banker who'd followed David to Dallas 5 years ago when his New York ventures collapsed. The brother David had bailed out, invested in, and welcomed into their lives. Tom leaned down as Betty whispered something in his ear. His hand rested at the small of her back, too low, too familiar. She giggled at whatever response he offered, her fingers lingering on his forearm that David's jaw tightened. He'd seen the signs for months. The late nights, the text messages Betty guarded, the weekend charity events that somehow never produced any photos. His mother-in-law, Eleanor, approached and sat beside him. "David, you're being antisocial. This gathering was your idea." It hadn't been. Betty had organized it without consulting him, just like she did most things these days. "Just tired, Eleanor. Long surgery today." He forced a smile. She patted his knee. "You work too hard. Unlike my Betty, she knows how to enjoy life." The comment stung, but David kept his face neutral. 19 years of marriage had taught him control. Saving lives daily had instilled in him a calm that bordered on detachment. The front door opened, and his daughter Lennon strolled in. At 17, she already acted like the world owed her everything. Tonight, she wore a dress David had never seen black, too short, too expensive with a diamond necklace he definitely hadn't purchased. "Dad." She barely acknowledged him as she breezed past, heading straight for her uncle. "Uncle Tom, Mom didn't tell me you'd be here." She embraced him with more enthusiasm than she'd shown David in years. Tom ruffled her hair. "Wouldn't miss it, kiddo." "Like the necklace?" "Early graduation present." David frowned. Graduation was 8 months away, and since when did uncles give diamond necklaces as presents? His phone vibrated in his pocket. Probably the hospital. He pulled it out, expecting an emergency call back to surgery. Instead, a notification from his credit card company flashed on the screen. Unusual spending alert. $110,000 in purchases in the last 24 hours. David sat up straight, adrenaline coursing through him. He opened the app. Designer clothes. Jewelry. First-class tickets to Paris. A hotel booking at the Four Seasons. All charged to his platinum card, the one he kept specifically for family expenses, the one Betty and Lennon had access to. The room suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. David stood up, his movements sharp and precise. "Who spent $110,000 on my credit card?" His voice cut through the chatter, not loud, but precise, the same tone he used when calling for instruments in the operating room. The conversation stopped. Heads turned. Lennon rolled her eyes dramatically. "Relax, Dad. You'll make more money." David stared at his daughter, barely recognizing the entitled stranger who stood before him. "That's not the point, Lennon. That money was meant for..." "For what?" "Your precious retirement fund." She sneered. "God, you're so boring. All you care about is saving and investing while the rest of us try to actually live." Betty sipped her wine, leaning against the marble kitchen island. "Don't start drama, David. Not tonight." "Drama?" David's voice remained even, though his pulse raced. "I'm asking about unauthorized charges on my credit card." "That's not drama, Betty. That's theft." His brother-in-law, Jeffrey, chuckled. "Come on, Dave. When you make what you make, Does it really matter? Several relatives nodded in agreement. David looked around the room at the people who lived in homes he'd helped pay for, who drove cars he'd financed, who took vacations on his dime. People who now had the audacity to tell him how he should feel about being robbed. Lennon tossed her hair over her shoulder. You're not even in charge of this family anymore. Uncle Tom is more of a father than you ever were. The room went silent. David felt something crack inside him, not his heart, but the carefully constructed dam that had held back his rage for months. He looked at Betty, waiting for her to defend him, to say anything to contradict their daughter's statement. She didn't. She simply took another sip of her Pinot Noir and checked her manicure. Is that true? David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Betty sighed, as if the question bored her. Then she leaned forward, placing her glass on the counter. David, you need to grow up and accept reality. Affairs happen. It's normal. Everyone here agrees. Move on or leave. The room blurred at the edges of David's vision. He looked around at the faces watching this spectacle, his in-laws, his parents, his cousins. Not one of them seemed shocked. Not one came to his defense. They knew. They all knew. His entire life had been a performance for an audience that had always hoped he would fail. They'd tolerated him because of his money, his status, his ability to provide the lifestyle to which they'd become accustomed. But they'd never respected him. David felt his hands tighten into fists, then deliberately relaxed them. 19 years of control wouldn't abandon him now. I see, he said finally. He set his glass down, walked to the coat closet, and retrieved his keys. Betty called after him, irritation in her voice. Where are you going? We have guests. They're your guests, David replied without turning around. And this is your show. He walked out the front door, closed it quietly behind him, and got into his car. As he started the engine, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. His face looked the same, still handsome at 42, with just a touch of gray at his temples. His eyes, though, had changed. They held something new. That was the moment he decided. They would all regret this. David drove aimlessly through the Dallas streets, his mind cataloging years of slights and suspicions that he dismissed as paranoia. The unexplained charges. The weekends when Betty was unavailable. The way Lennon had grown increasingly hostile toward him while growing closer to Tom. His phone rang incessantly. Betty, then his mother, then Betty again. He silenced it after the third call. He found himself pulling into the parking lot of Redemption Bar and Grill, a place far from his usual haunts. The kind of place where a man could drink without running into colleagues or country club members. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, with neon beer signs providing most of the illumination. David took a seat at the far end, away from the small clusters of patrons watching a basketball game on the mounted televisions. Bourbon neat, he told the bartender, a tattooed woman who nodded without asking questions. Make that too, a familiar voice said. David turned to find Gideon Vance sliding onto the stool beside him. His oldest friend looked exactly as he always did, buzz-cut military precision, weathered face, alert eyes that missed nothing. How did you find me? David asked. Gideon tapped his phone. You still have your location sharing on. Sloppy, for a man on the run. The bartender returned with their drinks. Gideon raised his glass. To whatever catastrophe brought you to a dive bar on a Thursday night. David clinked glasses mechanically and took a swallow. Betty's sleeping with Tom. Gideon didn't react with surprise, and that told David everything. You knew, David said flatly. Suspected, Gideon corrected. Didn't have proof, didn't think you'd want to hear speculation. He took a drink. How'd you find out? David recounted the evening, the credit card charges, Lennon's comment, Betty's casual admission, the family's tacit approval. With each detail, Gideon's expression darkened. So they all knew, he said when David finished. And they expected you to just, what? Share your wife and wallet with your brother? David stared into his drink. Apparently. And you walked out. I did. Gideon studied him. You're too calm. That worries me. A small smile played at the corner of David's mouth. They think I'll accept it, that I'll crawl back. But you're planning something else, Gideon said. Not a question, but a statement. I'm going to destroy them, David replied, his voice soft but certain. Every last one of them. Gideon leaned back, assessing his friend. During their time together in medical school, David had always been the controlled one, the voice of reason. Gideon had gone on to become a military medic, serving 3 tours before returning to civilian life as the head of security for a private firm. He knew what men looked like when they reached their breaking point. David had reached his. "You should know," Gideon said carefully, "revenge rarely brings the satisfaction people think it will. This isn't about satisfaction." David's eyes were cold. "It's about justice." Gideon signaled for another round. "Then you'll need help. And a place to stay. I have hotels. Hotels have records. Records can be traced." Gideon pulled out his phone. "I have a better option. Corporate apartment my company keeps for visiting executives. Off the books, fully stocked, secure building." David nodded his thanks. The alcohol had done nothing to dull the pain, but it had sharpened his focus. He pulled out his own phone, ignoring the missed calls, and opened his banking app. "First step," he said, more to himself than to Gideon, "cut off the money." "Hold up," Gideon cautioned. "You need to think strategically. If you start moving money around tonight, they'll know you're planning something." David paused, finger hovering over the screen. "You're right. I need to be smart about this." "What you need," Gideon said, "is a good night's sleep and a clear head. Revenge is a dish best served cold, my friend." David pocketed his phone. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," Gideon agreed. "I'll make some calls." As they finished their drinks, David felt a cold clarity settling over him. The pain remained, a hollow ache in his chest, but it was now accompanied by something else. Purpose. They thought they knew him. They thought he was weak, predictable, controllable. They were wrong. David woke at 5:30 a.m. Same as every morning, his mind immediately cleared despite the 3 hours of sleep. The corporate apartment Gideon had arranged was minimal but functional, a sleek 1-bedroom with views of downtown Dallas. Anonymous. Perfect that he performed his usual morning routine. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, a 5-minute cold shower. Controls started with the body.by 6 a.m. He sat at the kitchenette counter with his laptop open, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him. His phone showed 27 missed calls and 43 text messages. He ignored them all. Instead, he pulled up his financial dashboard, the complete picture of the Renshaw family finances that only he could access. 19 years of methodical investing, saving, and planning had created a complex web of accounts, properties, and assets. Most importantly, he'd kept the majority of it in his name alone. Betty had never shown interest in the financial details. She'd been content to spend while he managed. That disinterest would cost her dearly now that a knock at the door interrupted his assessment. David checked the peephole before opening it to admit Gideon, who carried a cardboard tray with 2 coffees and a paper bag. "Brought breakfast," Gideon said, setting everything on the counter. "Figured you wouldn't have eaten." "Not hungry," David replied, but accepted the coffee. Gideon offered cream, no sugar, exactly as he liked it. Gideon peered at the laptop screen. "Financial warfare. Smart opening move. It's where they'll feel it first," David said. "Betty and Lennon haven't worked a day in their lives. Tom's investment firm is 90% funded by my capital. Cut off the money and they'll panic. What about your patients? The hospital will be calling." David had already thought of this. "I've got a conference in Houston next week. I'll call my assistant, tell her I'm taking personal time before that. She can reschedule my appointments." Gideon nodded, impressed by David's foresight. "You need a lawyer. A shark." Already texted Isla Pierce. David sipped his coffee. "She handled the Matthews divorce last year. Husband caught his wife with the tennis instructor. Isla left the wife with nothing but a bus pass. Isla's expensive, worth every penny. She's meeting me here at noon." Gideon unwrapped an egg sandwich and pushed half toward David. "Eat. Can't plot revenge on an empty stomach." David took a mechanical bite, not tasting it. His mind was already mapping out the next steps. "I need to move fast. Betty will be contacting lawyers today. She'll go for the sympathy angle," Gideon predicted. "Poor wife, workaholic husband, emotional neglect." David's jaw tightened. "She could try." His phone buzzed with a text. Gideon glanced at it. Betty again. My mother, David said, checking the message. Please call us. We're worried about you. He set the phone down without responding. They'll all try to contact you, Gideon warned. Damage control. Let them try. David turned back to his laptop. I'm not interested in anything they have to say. They worked methodically through the morning. David created a list of all joint accounts, credit cards, and assets that needed to be secured. Gideon made calls to contacts at various security firms, arranging for digital surveillance and protection. At 11:58, the apartment buzzer sounded. David admitted Isla Pierce, a sharp-featured woman in her mid-30s with calculating eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Renshaw, she said, setting her briefcase on the counter. Your text was intriguing. Need to destroy my cheating wife legally and completely. Not your typical consultation request. I'm not your typical client, David replied. And I'm willing to pay triple your usual retainer for absolute discretion and priority treatment. Isla's eyebrows rose slightly. I'm listening. For the next hour, David laid out the situation while Isla took notes on her tablet. He detailed the affair, the family's betrayal, and his financial position. Isla asked pointed questions about asset distribution, prenuptial agreements, there wasn't one, and documentation of the affair. Without a prenup, Texas community property laws apply, she said. Normally, that means a 50-50 split. However, given the adultery and the fact that you've maintained separate account for most assets, we have leverage. I don't want leverage, David said coldly. I want her ruined. Isla studied him, then nodded. I can work with that. First step, file for divorce citing adultery. We'll need evidence. I can get that, Gideon interjected. Isla continued. Second, we freeze all joint accounts immediately. Third, we document every penny she spent of your money, especially any that went toward facilitating the affair. Texas judges don't look kindly on spouses who use marital funds to finance infidelity. What about my daughter? David asked that Isla's expression softened slightly. She's 17, nearly an adult. Legally, you could cut her off completely once she turns 18. David's face remained impassive. And before then, you're obligated to provide basic support. Food, shelter, education. Nothing says it has to be luxury accommodations or private school. David nodded. Do it. All of it. Isla opened her briefcase and removed several documents. I need your signatures on these. Power of attorney for financial matters. Authorization to file divorce proceedings. Retainer agreement. As David signed, his phone buzzed again. Betty's face appeared on the screen. He declined the call without comment. She'll keep trying, Isla warned. Don't engage. Everything goes through me now. The phone immediately rang again. This time, it was the hospital. David answered, his voice instantly shifting to his professional tone. Dr. Renshaw. David, it's Angela. His assistant sounded concerned. You missed morning rounds. Dr. Peterson covered, but everyone's asking questions. I apologize for not calling earlier, David said smoothly. I've had a family emergency. I need to take personal time before the Houston conference. Please reschedule all my appointments for the next week. Of course, Angela replied. Is everything all right? It will be, David said. Thank you, Angela. He ended the call and turned back to find both Gideon and Isla watching him with a mixture of concern and admiration. What? He asked. Nothing, Gideon said. Just impressed by how quickly you can switch from avenging angel to concerned doctor. Years of practice, David replied. In surgery, you can't let emotions interfere with precision. Isla gathered her signed documents. I'll file these immediately. By this afternoon, Mrs. Renshaw will find her financial access significantly reduced. I suggest you be unreachable when that happens. That won't be a problem, David assured her. After Isla left, Gideon pulled out his phone. I've got a guy who can track Tom's movements. We'll have photographic evidence of the affair within 48 hours. David nodded, then walked to the window. From the 20th floor, he could see the sprawl of Dallas, the city where he'd built his reputation, his fortune, his family. The family that had betrayed him so completely. You're still too calm, Gideon observed, coming to stand beside him. That still worries me. David's reflection in the glass showed no emotion. I spent 19 years being the perfect husband, the provider, the stable one. I performed life-saving surgeries all day, then came home to a wife who was sleeping with my brother and a daughter who despised me. And now I'm going to show them exactly who I really am. David turned from the window, the man they should have feared all along. Gideon studied his friend, then nodded slowly. They'll try to paint you as the villain, you know, the controlling husband, the cold father. Let them try, David replied, walking back to his laptop. Actions have consequences. It's time they learned that lesson. He opened his email and began composing a message to his bank's private client manager. The first domino was about to fall. That night, as David sat alone in the dark apartment, his laptop illuminated his face with a harsh blue glow. On the screen, a family photo taken just 6 months ago. David, Betty, and Lennon smiling on the deck of their vacation home in Aspen. A perfect family. A perfect life. He stared at the photo for a long moment, then closed the laptop. Tomorrow, the destruction would begin. Betty Renshaw woke to the insistent buzzing of her phone. She ignored it at first, pulling a silk sleep mask off her eyes and reaching to the other side of the king-sized bed. Empty. David hadn't come home last night. His loss, she muttered, though a flicker of unease passed through her. David had never stayed away all night before, not in 19 years of marriage. He'd always been pathetically reliable. The phone buzzed again, screen lighting up with notifications. Betty grabbed it, expecting to see David's name. Instead, she found 112 missed calls. Not from David. From banks, credit card companies, car dealerships, her friends. What the hell? She whispered, a knot forming in her stomach. She opened the first text message from American Express. Fraud alert. Your recent charges for $110,000 have been reversed following cardholder dispute. Please contact customer service immediately. Betty sat up straight, fully awake now. She tapped through to the next alert from their joint checking account. Authorization removed. Additional signature now required for all transactions, and another from Chase Private Client. Your access to accounts ending in 4271, 8835, and 9912 has been terminated. Please contact account holder for reinstatement. The wall seemed to close in as Betty scrolled through message after message. Every account, every credit card, every financial resource she had relied on for 19 years gone. Just like that, she jumped out of bed, racing to her closet where she kept her emergency cash. The shoebox on the top shelf contained $5,000 money she'd skimmed from household expenses over the years. Not nearly enough that Betty's hands trembled as she dialed David's number. Straight to voicemail. David, call me back immediately. What do you think you're doing? You can't just cut me off like this. Her second call went straight to voicemail too. Betty paced the bedroom, mind racing. She'd expected anger from David, perhaps a confrontation, but not this silent, methodical attack that Lennon's shout echoed from downstairs. Mom! Mom! Betty found her daughter in the kitchen, still in pajamas, face flushed with panic. My cards aren't working. None of them. Lennon thrust her phone in Betty's face, showing declined transaction notifications. And my car is gone. What do you mean gone? I mean, it's not in the garage. It's not in the driveway. It's gone. Lennon's voice rose hysterically. And my Uber account is blocked. I can't even get to Megan's house. Betty tried to project calm she didn't feel. Your father is just throwing a tantrum. He'll calm down. Really? Because he never gets mad. Lennon's eyes narrowed. What exactly happened last night? Before Betty could answer, her phone chimed with a new email. The subject line made her blood run cold. Notice of eviction, property sold. She opened it with shaking fingers. Mrs. Renshaw. This letter serves as formal notice that ownership of the property at 4721 Turtle Creek Boulevard has been transferred to Stone Creek Holdings, LLC. As the property is under new ownership, all current residents must vacate within 30 days. Any questions should be directed to the law offices of Pierce & Associates. Respectfully, Eslaw Pierce, ESQ. Betty read it twice, not comprehending. The house was in both their names. David couldn't sell it without her signature. Could he? Mom. Lennon's voice had lost its edge. now small and frightened. What's happening? Betty's mind raced through possibilities. The house must be in David's name alone. The cars, too. She'd never paid attention to whose name was on what paperwork. David had handled all of that. Your father, Betty said slowly, is trying to scare us. Well, it's working. Lennon held up her phone. Nordstrom just declined my card for a $60 purchase. $60, Mom. Betty's phone rang. Tom calling. She answered immediately. Betty, what the hell is going on? Tom's voice was tight with panic. My accounts are frozen. My office lease payment bounced. I've got clients threatening to walk. David, Betty said, the word like acid on her tongue. He's cutting us off. He can't do that, Tom insisted. I'm his brother. My business is separate. Is it? Betty countered, the truth dawning. How much did he invest in your firm? Tom's silence was answer enough. We need to talk. In person, Betty said. Come over. I can't. Tom's voice dropped. My car's gone. Repossessed an hour ago. They said the payments were 6 months behind. Betty clutched the counter for support. That's impossible. David always paid. She stopped, realizing her mistake. David had always paid. For everything. Get here however you can, she snapped, ending the call. Lennon stood watching, arms crossed. So what now? Now we call a lawyer, Betty replied, already scrolling through her contacts. Your father thinks he can just erase us? He's about to learn otherwise. 3 hours later, Betty sat across from Vernon Walsh, the most respected divorce attorney in Dallas. His office screamed old money mahogany desks, leather chairs, law books lining the walls. Tom slouched beside her, having arrived by Uber. Lennon had refused to come, staying home to call friend for loans that none would provide. This is ridiculous, Betty fumed, finishing her explanation. He can't just cut us off completely. Walsh adjusted his glasses, reviewing the documents she'd brought. Mrs. Renshaw, I need to ask some direct questions. Were you having an affair with your husband's brother? That's not relevant, Betty protested. It is extremely relevant, Walsh countered. Texas is a fault state for divorce. Adultery matters. Fine. Yes. Betty waved dismissively. But David worked all the time. He was never there emotionally. Walsh's expression didn't change. Did you spend marital funds to facilitate this affair? Tom shifted uncomfortably. Betty glared at him. Define marital funds, she hedged. Hotels, gifts, trips, maybe some, Betty admitted. But I'm entitled to spend household money. Walsh sighed. Mrs. Renshaw, I need to be completely honest with you. Based on what you've told me, Dr. Renshaw appears to have acted entirely within his legal rights. What? Betty leaned forward. How can that be? The house is solely in his name. The vehicles as well. He was authorized to report credit card fraud if charges were made without his consent. Walsh closed the folder. As for the joint accounts, he's permitted to remove your access pending divorce proceedings. But that's not fair. Betty's voice rose. Fair and legal are different matters, Walsh replied. Now, regarding your brother-in-law's business, Tom straightened. My business is separate. David was just an investor. An investor who owned 70%. Betty corrected. Walsh's eyebrows rose. 70%? Then legally, Dr. Renshaw controls the company. Tom slumped back. He wouldn't destroy his own investment just to hurt me. Walsh's expression was grim. In my experience, people in Dr. Renshaw's position often prioritize justice over finances. So what can we do? Betty demanded. We can file for temporary spousal support, Walsh said. But given the adultery factor, don't expect much. As for the eviction, if the house is truly in his name alone, there's little recourse. Betty felt the walls closing in. So he just wins? After I gave him 19 years of my life. Walsh removed his glasses. Mrs. Renshaw, may I speak frankly? You admitted to adultery with your husband's brother. You spent significant marital assets without consent. Your daughter apparently made comments confirming this relationship. If this goes to court, you'll be at a severe disadvantage. So you won't take my case. Betty's voice was cold. I didn't say that. Walsh replaced his glasses. But I need you to have realistic expectations. The best outcome here is probably a settlement if Dr. Renshaw is willing to offer one. Betty stood, grabbing her purse. David thinks he can just erase us from his life. He's wrong. Come on, Tom. Outside the office, Tom grabbed her arm. Betty, we need to be smart here. David's always 10 steps ahead. He's not just angry, he's methodical. You sound scared. Betty yanked her arm away. I'm scared, Tom hissed. My entire business is crumbling. My reputation. Your reputation. Betty laughed bitterly. You're worried about that now? After parading around with your brother's wife for months. You weren't exactly subtle either. Tom shot back. Flirting with me in front of him in your own home. What did you expect? I expected loyalty from my family. Betty's eyes flashed. No one was supposed to tell him. They glared at each other, united in betrayal, but divided by blame. We need to regroup, Tom finally said. Figure out our next move. Betty's phone buzzed with a text from Lennon. Mom, something's happening online. Call me now. Too late, Betty whispered. He's already made his next move. David sat in his temporary office at Gideon's security firm, watching the social media storm unfold on multiple monitors. He hadn't touched a keyboard, he'd merely provided the evidence. Gideon's digital team had handled the rest. An anonymous Twitter account had appeared overnight. Truth Revealed _us. Its first post was simple. What happens when a devoted husband discovers his wife's affair with his own brother? The Renshaw family is about to find out. Evidence to follow. And follow it did. Screenshots of text messages between Betty and Tom, going back months. Photos taken by Gideon's surveillance team, Betty and Tom entering a hotel, kissing in his car, holding hands at restaurants miles from home where they thought no one would see. Most damning were the voice recordings, Betty mocking David's devotion while Tom laughed. Poor David. Her voice played clearly through the office speakers. So loyal, so boring. He actually thinks I love him after all these years. Tom's reply. The man's a walking ATM with a medical degree. At least you're getting something out of it. David watched the view count rise, his face impassive. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but Betty had forced his hand. The family gathering had made it clear they'd expected him to accept public humiliation. Now, they would experience it themselves. Gideon entered with coffee. Second wave just dropped. Screenshots of Lennon's texts about you. David clicked to the new posts. There was his daughter's face, beside messages sent to her friends. Dad is such a clueless idiot. Thinks he's so important with his doctor job. Doesn't even notice mom's been sleeping with Uncle Tom for months. Loland another. Just charged $5,000 to Dad's card. He won't even check. Too busy saving lives, or whatever. What a joke. David felt a tightness in his chest, but pushed it away. Weakness wouldn't help him now. And Tom's business? He asked. Gideon pulled up another screen. The anonymous whistleblower email went to all his major clients and the state regulatory board this morning, complete with documentation of the fraudulent investments. Not anonymous, David corrected. Those are genuine financial documents with my signature as majority owner. I'm officially reporting suspected fraud in my own company. Cold, Gideon said, but with admiration that David's phone rang a Dallas area code he didn't recognize. Dr. Renshaw. His voice was calm, professional. David, it's Eleanor. His mother-in-law's voice shook with rage. What have you done? I've done exactly what the entire family suggested, David replied. I'm moving on. By destroying my daughter? Your own child? Your brother? They made their choices. David kept his tone even. Actions have consequences. Betty's been blacklisted by every medical office in Dallas. Eleanor shouted. Her friends won't return her calls. The country club has revoked her membership. Unfortunate. Is that all you have to say? She demanded. After 20 years in this family? 19, David corrected. And yes, that's all I have to say. To any of you. He ended the call and turned back to the monitors. Local news sites had picked up the story. Prominent surgeon exposes wife and brother's affair, read one headline. Dallas medical community stunned by Renshaw family scandal, announced another. His work phone buzzed with a text from Angela at the hospital. Board meeting emergency session about the publicity. Do you need support? David appreciated her loyalty. No need. This will blow over. Patients come first. Gideon watched him with concern. You okay? Why wouldn't I be? David's voice was flat. Because your personal life is now front-page news. David shrugged. Better the truth than the lie I was living. His phone rang again, Lennon this time. He stared at the screen, finger hovering over decline. You should talk to her, Gideon suggested. She's still your daughter. David accepted the call, but said nothing. Dad. Lennon's voice was small, broken. Please make it stop. Make what stop, Lennon? His tone remained neutral. You know what? The posts. Everyone's seen them. My friends are all ghosting me. I can't even show my face at school. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate? She shrieked. Is that all you can say? My life is ruined. Actions have consequences. The same words he'd used with Eleanor, delivered in the same detached tone. So, this is punishment? For what? For spending your money? For being closer to Uncle Tom? David closed his eyes briefly. For betrayal, Lennon. For being part of a conspiracy to humiliate me. For laughing at me behind my back. For calling me stupid while spending my money. Silence on the line. But you're my father, she finally whispered. Yes, David agreed. I am. Something you might want to remember going forward. What does that mean? It means I control your tuition, your housing, your future. You're threatening me? Her voice rose again. I'm stating facts. Whether they're threats depends on your perspective. Mom was right about you, Lennon spat. You're cold. You never loved us. I loved you both more than anything, David said, his voice finally betraying emotion. That was my mistake. He ended the call and set the phone down carefully. Gideon cleared his throat. Phase 3. David nodded. Call Isla. It's time for the final move. Across town, Betty's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Not with calls from friends they'd all disappeared, but from reporters, strangers, internet trolls who'd somehow gotten her number. She sat on her bedroom floor, back against the wall, scrolling through the wreckage of her life on social media. Every secret exposed. Every nasty comment about David. Every private moment with Tom laid bare for public consumption. Her therapy practice had called that morning to temporarily suspend their relationship. The School Parents Association had requested her resignation. Even her yoga studio had refunded her annual membership fee that a text from her best friend of 15 years. I always suspected something was off. David deserved better. Please don't contact me again. The doorbell rang. Betty ignored it. Then it rang again, persistently. She dragged herself downstairs, past Lennon who sat crying in the living room, to open the door to a courier stood there, envelope in hand. Betty Renshaw. Yes, she said wearily. Please sign here. Betty scribbled on his tablet and took the envelope, closing the door before he could offer unwanted sympathy. The return address showed Pierce and Associates. She tore it open, already knowing what she'd find. Divorce papers. Detailed, comprehensive, brutal. Betty scanned the terms with growing horror. David was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery. He sought complete separation of assets, with all property acquired during marriage remaining with the original purchaser. Since David had paid for everything, the house, the cars, the investments, even her business startup cost, she would be left with nothing. That a separate letter from Isla Pierce stated that Dr. Renshaw would consider providing a one-time settlement of $100,000, contingent upon a full non-disclosure agreement and Betty's immediate departure from Dallas. Betty sank onto the bottom. Stare, papers clutched in her trembling hands. The front door opened again. Tom stumbled in, tie askew, face ashen. The IRS, he said without preamble. They're auditing everything. 5 years of records. David reported inconsistencies in the company finances. What inconsistencies? Betty asked, voice hollow. The ones he created. Tom shouted. He transferred money between accounts for years, building a paper trail that makes it look like I was embezzling from investors. He set me up from the beginning. He wouldn't do that, Betty protested. He's angry, but he wouldn't plan something that elaborate just in case we... In case we what? Betrayed him? Tom laughed bitterly. He's always been 10 steps ahead. The perfect, patient, brilliant Dr. Renshaw. You think this is just reaction? He's been planning this since the first time he suspected something. Betty stared at the divorce papers. You're wrong. This is impulse. Anger. He'll calm down. Tom grabbed the papers from her hand, flipping through them. Look at this. These aren't standard divorce forms. This is a customized legal assault. No lawyer drafts something this detailed in 2 days. Then he's been planning to divorce me, Betty said, but not all of this. Tom sank down beside her on the stair. My firm is collapsing. Every client has pulled out. My investors are suing me. The IRS is investigating potential criminal charges. He can't get away with this, Betty whispered. He already has. Tom put his head in his hands. Game over. He won. Betty's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Checkmate. 1 week later, David sat across from Eslaw Pierce in her downtown office, reviewing the final divorce settlement. Betty signed everything. Eslaw confirmed, passing him the notarized documents. No contest, no court appearance, full acceptance of terms. An NDA, signed and binding. She can't discuss your marriage, the divorce, or any aspect of her relationship with Tom without facing severe financial penalties. David nodded, feeling nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just emptiness where 19 years of his life had been. Your brother refused the settlement offer. Eslaw continued. Said he'd rather face bankruptcy than take your money. His choice, David said. The IRS investigation is proceeding. Based on the evidence you provided, they're likely to pursue criminal charges. David signed the final page without comment. Eslaw studied him across the desk. This is the most complete divorce victory I've ever secured, Dr. Renshaw. You've walked away with every asset intact. Your reputation has been preserved while theirs are in tatters. By any measure, you've won. Yes. David placed the pen down carefully. Is there anything else? Just one matter. Eslaw slid another document across the desk. Your daughter. She's 17. Technically a minor for another 7 months. You're still legally responsible for her basic care. I'm aware of my legal obligations. She's requested to continue at Dallas Preparatory through graduation. Tuition is due next week. David considered this. Pay it. Also her basic living expenses. Nothing beyond necessities. And after she turns 18, nothing. Eslaw nodded, making notes. May I speak candidly, Dr. Renshaw? Of course. In my experience, revenge rarely brings the peace people hope for. You've won completely. Perhaps consider mercy for your daughter. She's young, impressionable, was following her mother's lead. David's expression didn't change. She made her choice. People can change. Yes, David agreed. I have. Outside the office, David checked his messages. The hospital board had voted unanimously to keep him on staff, recognizing that he was the wrong party in the scandal. His practice was busier than ever. Apparently, becoming the center of a society scandal had only increased demand for his services. A text from Gideon. Meeting set with Houston Memorial. They're offering chief of cardiothoracic surgery. Fresh start. David typed back. Accept the meeting. Time to move on. As his driver navigated through downtown Dallas traffic, David's phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local. Against his better judgment, he answered. Dr. Renshaw. David. Betty's voice was stripped of its usual confidence. Please don't hang up. He said nothing, just waited. I signed the papers, she said. You got everything you wanted. Did I? His voice was cold. What more could you possibly want? You've taken our home, our money, our reputation. You've destroyed Tom's business. You've turned Lennon's friends against her. Isn't that enough? You tell me, Betty. Is it enough? When you all sat in our home and told me to accept your betrayal, would you have been satisfied with anything less than my complete humiliation? Silence on the line. That's what I thought, David said. We can still fix this. Betty's voice turned pleading. For Lennon's sake, at least. She's devastated. Lennon will survive. She's learned a valuable lesson about loyalty. You're punishing your own child for my mistakes. No. David's voice hardened. I'm holding her accountable for her own choices. She chose to mock me, steal from me, and support your affair. Now, she can live with those decisions. David, please. Betty's voice broke. I have nothing left. You have exactly what you earned. 19 years. Betty cried. Doesn't that count for anything? It counted for everything, David replied. That's why your betrayal warranted this response. The car pulled up to his new penthouse building. Goodbye, Betty. Wait. David. He ended the call and stepped out of the car. The doorman greeted him by name as he entered the sleek lobby. In the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished brass. He looked the same, perhaps a bit thinner, with new lines around his eyes, but inside, he was someone else entirely. The penthouse was minimalist, impersonal. No family photos, no mementos, nothing that connected him to his previous life. Just clean surfaces and city views. Perfect. His phone buzzed with a text from Angela at the hospital. Dr. Kane asking if you'll reconsider the Houston offer. Says Dallas needs you. David didn't respond. Dallas had nothing for him now except memories he wanted to forget. Another text chimed in, this one from Gideon. Dinner tonight? New steakhouse downtown. David replied, can't. Preparing for Houston presentation. All work and no play. Gideon texted back. At least you're consistent. David set the phone down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Dallas skyline sparkled in the evening light. For 19 years, he'd built a life here, a career, a family, a reputation. Now half of that was gone, destroyed by the people he'd trusted most. His phone rang again. Lennon this time. He let it go to voicemail, but a minute later, the notification appeared. He hesitated, then played the message. Dad. Lennon's voice was thick with tears. I'm sorry. I know you don't believe me, but I am. What I said that night. I was trying to hurt you. I don't know why. I miss you. Please call me back. David deleted the message. Too little, too late that he'd trusted once. Loved completely. Given everything. Look where it had gotten him. Never again. The intercom buzzed. Security announcing a visitor. David frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Send them up, he instructed after hearing the name. Minutes later, a knock at his door. David opened it to find Isla Pierce, legal briefcase in hand. This couldn't wait until morning, he asked, stepping aside to let her enter. I've been your attorney long enough to know you don't sleep much, Isla replied, setting her briefcase on the kitchen counter. Besides, this is time-sensitive. She removed a folder and passed it to him. Betty's counterproposal. She's asking for a modification to the settlement. The papers are signed, David said flatly. There is no modification. Hear me out. Isla held up a hand. She's not asking for money or property. She wants visitation with Lennon. Lennon is 17, not 7. She can see her mother whenever she wants. Betty's moving to Phoenix. Lennon wants to finish school here. You're controlling the finances that would allow visits. David handed the folder back. Not my problem. Isla didn't take it. There's something else. I received this from Lennon's school counselor. She produced another document, an email printout. David skimmed it, jaw tightening. Suicidal ideation, he said, voice carefully controlled. Apparently, she's struggling with the overnight destruction of her family and social standing. David set the email down. So now I'm responsible for my daughter's mental health after she actively participated in betraying me. You're a father, Isla said simply. And despite everything, I think you still care about her. Care? David laughed harshly. Care is what got me into this situation. I cared about my wife, my brother, my daughter. Look where it led. You've won, Dr. Renshaw, Isla said quietly. Complete victory. The question now is, what kind of victor will you be? David turned away, staring out at the city lights. The kind who doesn't get fooled twice. Even at the cost of your daughter's well-being. She made her choice, David repeated, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. She's 17, Isla countered. You're the adult. David remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he turned back. What exactly does Betty want? Monthly visitation. You pay for Lennon's ticket to Phoenix once Betty relocates. And Lennon? What does she want? To apologize in person. To try to rebuild some relationship with her father. David picked up his phone, scrolling to the deleted voicemail from Lennon. Gone, just like his trust in her. I'll consider it, he said finally. No promises. Isla gathered her papers. That's all I'm asking. After she left, David poured himself a drink and returned to the window. In the reflection of the glass, he saw not just himself, but the ghost of the man he used to be trusting, devoted, weak. That man was gone. The new David Renshaw had emerged from betrayal stronger, colder, unstoppable. He'd brought his enemies to their knees in less than a week. Destroyed the people who'd tried to destroy him. In the operating room. They called him the machine for his precision, his detachment, his ability to make the hard cuts without hesitation. Now he brought that same clinical efficiency to excising the cancer from his personal life. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he deleted, but still recognized. "Betty, please, for Lennon's sake if not mine. Talk to her," but he deleted the message without responding. Then he blocked the number. "Checkmate," he said to the empty room. 3 months passed. David settled into his new life with the precision he applied to everything. New penthouse, new routine, new outlook. He stood at the window of his 48th floor penthouse, coffee in hand, watching Dallas wake up below him. The Houston offer had come through chief of cardiothoracic surgery, double his current salary, a research budget that made his colleagues at Dallas Memorial weep with envy. He'd accepted without hesitation. His phone buzzed on the marble countertop. "Isla Pierce." "Good morning," he answered. "Dr. Renshaw, I have updates." Isla's voice was crisp, professional. Their relationship had evolved over the past months. Business at first, then dinners to discuss legal matters, then dinners with no legal matters to discuss at all. "Go ahead. The sale of your former residence is complete. 15% over asking. The profits have been transferred to your account." David took a sip of coffee. "And the occupants?" "Vacated last week, as required by court order." Mrs. Renshaw apparently relocated to her mother's place. He felt nothing at the news. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just acknowledgement of facts. "And Tom," he asked, "your brother's legal troubles are mounting. The IRS investigation uncovered several instances of tax fraud. Criminal charges are pending. His passport has been flagged." David nodded slightly. "Everything proceeding according to plan. Thank you for the update. We'll discuss the Houston property over dinner." After ending the call, David returned to his morning routine. Shower, dress, review surgical cases for the day. His life had become a model of efficiency, uncluttered by emotional complications. The intercom buzzed. Frowning, David checked his watch. Too early for his driver. "Yes, Dr. Renshaw." The building's security chief's voice came through clearly. "There are 2 women in the lobby insisting on seeing you. They claim to be your wife and daughter." David's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "Former wife." "Yes, sir. They're quite persistent." The younger one seems distressed. David considered his options. He could refuse to see them, have security remove them. The simplest solution, yet something curiosity perhaps made him say, "Send them up." "And Diego?" "Sir, stay in the hall." "Understood." David straightened his tie and moved to the center of the living room. Positioned himself perfectly back to the window, the Dallas skyline behind him, standing rather than sitting. Power positioning, a skill he'd learned from watching Betty manipulate social situations for 19 years. The elevator chimed. A knock at the door. David took a deep breath and opened it. Betty looked like a shadow of herself. Designer clothes replaced by faded jeans and a simple blouse. Perfectly maintained blonde hair now dull, pulled back in a hasty ponytail. The confident gleam in her eye replaced by desperation. Lennon stood beside her, hunched in an oversized hoodie. Dark circles under her eyes, face pale and drawn. "David," Betty's voice caught. "Thank you for seeing us." He stepped back, allowing them to enter without speaking. Diego, the security chief, stood in the hallway, his presence a silent warning. Betty took in the penthouse with a quick glance, the minimal furnishings, the stunning views, the absence of any reminder of their shared life. "Nice place," she said, aiming for casual and missing by miles. David remained silent. Betty's forced smile faltered. "Please, David, just talk to me. Now you want to talk." His voice was cool, detached. Lennon looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "Dad, I was wrong. Now I'm dad again." David raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how that happens when the money stops flowing." "It's not about money," Lennon protested, tears forming. "Isn't it?" David looked between them. "You're not here because you miss me. You're here because you've lost your lifestyle. Your standing. Your comfort." "That's not fair," Betty said, stepping forward. "We've lost everything. Everything I provided," David corrected. "Everything you took for granted while betraying me." Betty's composure cracked. "I made a mistake." A terrible mistake. Don't punish Lennon for my choices. Lennon made her own choices. David's gaze shifted to his daughter. Mocked me to her friends. Stole from me. Chose Tom over her own father. I didn't understand what was happening, Lennon said, voice small. Mom and Uncle Tom. They made it seem normal. Don't blame your mother, David cut in. You're 17, not 7. You knew what you were doing. Betty's face crumpled. Please, I have nothing left. No job. No home. My mother barely speaks to me. My friends, they're all gone. And David's voice remained level. And I need help. Betty's control shattered. I can't get work anywhere in Dallas. No one will hire me with this scandal attached to my name. I can't even afford a decent apartment. David stepped closer, towering over her. You had everything, and you threw it away. People make mistakes. Betty cried, reaching for his arm. David stepped back. And people face consequences. Dad, please, Lennon begged. Mom's sorry. I'm sorry. We want to fix this. There's nothing to fix, David replied. Our family is over. By your choice, not mine. So that's it. Betty's desperation turned to anger. 19 years, and you just throw us away? That's rich, coming from you. David's smile didn't reach his eyes. Who threw who away, Betty? I never wanted a divorce. I never wanted to destroy our family. No, you just wanted me to accept your betrayal. To live with the humiliation. To keep funding your lifestyle while you slept with my brother. David shook his head. That was never going to happen. Betty lunged forward suddenly, grabbing his shirt. Look at me. Look what you've done to us. Diego appeared in the doorway instantly. David raised a hand, stopping him. What I've done. David carefully removed Betty's hands from his shirt. I simply exposed the truth. You created that truth. You've ruined us. Betty sobbed. We're barely surviving. Welcome to consequences. David nodded to Diego. We're done here. Diego stepped forward. Ma'am, miss, I need you to leave now. Betty stepped back, shock replacing anger. You're having us thrown out? You no longer have any right to be in my home. David's voice was ice. Just as you no longer have any right to my money, my name, or my concern. Diego took Betty's arm firmly but gently. Please, ma'am. Betty collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably as he guided her to the elevator. Lennon followed, her earlier contrition replaced by fury. As the elevator doors began to close, she screamed, You'll regret this. David watched the doors seal shut, cutting off her rage. In the sudden silence of his penthouse, he allowed himself a small smile. No, I won't. An hour later, David was in his car heading to the hospital for his final week of surgeries before the move to Houston. His phone rang. Gideon. Let me guess, David answered. Betty and Lennon made a scene in the lobby. Security handled it, Gideon confirmed. But there's something else. Lennon's school counselor called me, trying to reach you. Why would she call you? Because you've blocked all their numbers. Kids apparently having a breakdown. Failing classes, skipping school, the works. Not my problem, David replied, voice neutral. She's still your daughter, Gideon pointed out. Biologically, yes. In every way that matters? No. David watched the traffic ahead. She made her choice. Now she lives with it. Cold, man. Even for you. Is there anything else? I have surgery in 40 minutes. Gideon sighed. Restraining order paperwork is ready for your signature. Isla said to tell you she'll have it at dinner tonight. Perfect. After ending the call, David focused on the road ahead, pushing away any lingering thoughts of Betty or Lennon. They were part of his past now. A closed chapter. The only emotion he allowed himself was a brief satisfaction that justice had been served, completely, perfectly, without compromise. 6 months later, David sat in his new office at Houston Memorial, reviewing patient files. The transition had been seamless. New hospital, new staff, new reputation as not just a brilliant surgeon, but a man who tolerated no disrespect. The knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Come in. Gideon entered, looking out of place in his tactical pants and polo shirt amidst the medical environment. He whistled, taking in the corner office with its expansive views of the Houston skyline. Nice digs. Document definitely a step up from Dallas. David closed his laptop. What brings you to Houston? Besides critiquing my office, Can a guy visit his best friend without an interrogation? Gideon dropped into a chair opposite David's desk. Actually, I brought an update. Thought you might want it in person. Go on. Gideon pulled out his phone, scrolling through notes. Betty's working at Walton's Diner on the south side of Dallas. Waitressing. Makes minimum wage plus tips. David nodded, expression unchanged. She tried applying to medical offices in 3 counties. No takers. Your ex-mother-in-law finally kicked her out last month. Apparently, even maternal love has limits when the scandal won't die. Betty's in a studio apartment now, in a neighborhood where she used to refuse to even drive through. Lennon graduated barely. Dallas Prep didn't want the scandal of failing her, so they pushed her through despite her grades. No college acceptances yet. She's working retail at the mall, selling cell phone cases to teenagers. David leaned back in his chair. And Tom, Gideon grinned. The piece de resistance. Your brother fled to Arizona last week. One step ahead of the IRS agents who showed up with an arrest warrant. They froze his remaining accounts, seized his house. He's officially a fugitive. They'll catch him, David said with certainty. No doubt. He's not smart enough to stay hidden. Gideon studied his friend. You've won, David. Total victory. They're all paying exactly the price you wanted. Not what I wanted, David corrected. What they earned. Same difference. Gideon stood, walking to the window. You've done well for yourself, too. Chief of surgery at 42. New city. New life. He turned, eyebrow raised. New woman. David's expression softened slightly. Isla and I are exploring possibilities. The Ice Queen attorney. Gideon laughed. Should have seen that coming. You two are perfectly matched, brilliant, ruthless, and trust no one. I trust you, David pointed out. That's different. I've never given you reason not to. Gideon's expression turned serious. Betty called me last week. David's jaw tightened. What did she want? To talk to you. Said she has something important to tell you that can't go through lawyers. No, I told her as much. Gideon returned to his seat. She looks rough, David. Broken. Humiliated. Serving eggs to people who used to be her friends. Working double shifts to make rent on an apartment the size of your bathroom here. Your point. No point. Just an observation. Gideon shrugged. Justice is served cold and complete. I've never seen revenge executed so perfectly. And Lennon, David asked, his tone clinical. Any more melodramatic attempts to get my attention? She's working at the mall, like I said. Living with a friend since Betty can barely afford her own place. Gideon watched David carefully. School counselor says she's been asking about community college options. Can't afford a real university without your help. She'll learn the value of hard work, David replied without emotion. Something I clearly failed to teach her the first time around. You really don't care at all? Gideon asked. I cared once. Look where it got me. David checked his watch. I have surgery in 30 minutes. Always the surgeon. Gideon stood. Dinner tonight? I'm in town until tomorrow. Can't. Benefit gala at the museum. Isla's accompanying me. Ah, the power couple makes their Houston society debut. Gideon grinned. Moving fast with the lawyer. She understands me. Because she helped you destroy your ex-wife. Gideon raised an eyebrow. That's one hell of a meet cute. Because she values loyalty and consequences, David corrected. As do I. They walked to the door together. Gideon paused, hand on the knob. One last thing I've been wondering. With all this perfect revenge, did it help? Do you feel better? David considered the question. I feel correct. Justice was required. I delivered it. But are you happy, David? Happiness is overrated. I prefer respect. David opened the door. And now I have it. Still no forgiveness. Gideon asked, watching his friend carefully. David's smile was cold as he adjusted his white coat. Forgiveness is for the weak. That evening, David stood at the edge of the museum ballroom, watching Houston's elite mingle around priceless sculptures and flowing champagne. He'd made the expected rounds, greeting the hospital board members, thanking donors, establishing himself as a key figure in his new city's medical establishment. Isla appeared at his side, elegant in a simple black dress that accentuated her slender frame. At 34, she was younger than him, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been betrayed, never been fooled. You're hiding, she observed, handing him a fresh glass of champagne. Observing, he corrected. Different skill set. The board chairman's wife can't stop talking about the miracle you performed on her nephew last month. Isla sipped her drink. You've won them over already. It wasn't a miracle. It was surgical skill and preparation. She smiled. Your modesty is unconvincing, Dr. Renshaw. His phone vibrated in his pocket. David ignored it. That's the third time in 10 minutes, Isla noted. Something important? Nothing that can't wait. David guided her toward a quiet corner. I wanted to ask you something. Sounds serious. Her expression remained composed, but interest flickered in her eyes. My contract includes a signing bonus. I'm using it to purchase a property on Lake Houston. 5 acres, private access, custom home. He watched her face carefully. I'd like your opinion on it. My legal opinion on the purchase. Your personal opinion on the property. David held her gaze. As someone who might spend considerable time there. Understanding dawned in Isla's eyes. That's quite an invitation, David. We're alike, you and I, he said quietly. Clear-eyed about the world. Unwilling to accept betrayal. Capable of executing justice when necessary. Some would call that ruthless, Isla replied. I call it strength. David took her hand. The kind of strength I value. And if I ever disappointed you? Her question was direct, testing. You wouldn't. His certainty was absolute. You understand what loyalty means. Isla smiled, a rare, genuine warmth in her expression. I'd like to see this property. Tomorrow. She nodded, and they returned to the gathering, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. David felt a sense of rightness in this new world he'd built. Everything precise, everything earned, nothing given away for free, as he had given to Betty and Lennon for so many years. Later that night, as they left the gala, his phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number, but he recognized the Dallas area code. Dad, it's Lennon. Please, I need to talk to you. Just once. David deleted the message without replying, then blocked the number. That chapter was closed. Permanently. 2 weeks later, David stood on the deck of his new Lake Houston home, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Behind him, Isla moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner. They'd settled into a comfortable routine, her apartment in the city for weeknights, the lake house for weekends. Gideon arrived with a bottle of scotch and news from Dallas. Betty's still at the diner, he reported, joining David on the deck. Lennon got fired from the mall job. Apparently having a meltdown in front of customers isn't good for business. Her problem, David replied, eyes on the sunset. Not mine. Cold, Gideon observed, but consistent. The only way to be. Isla joined them, handing each man a glass of the scotch Gideon had brought. To new beginnings, she proposed. David raised his glass. And to consequences. Speaking of consequences, Gideon said, your brother's been arrested. Border Patrol caught him trying to sneak into Mexico with fake papers. Amateur move. Tom always did think he was smarter than he was, David replied. One of his many failings. They drank in comfortable silence, watching the day end and night begin. David felt nothing when he thought of Betty serving food to former friends, or Lennon struggling without the privilege she'd taken for granted, or Tom facing federal charges. They had earned their fate, just as he had earned this new life. A life where betrayal couldn't touch him, where the only people he allowed close were those who had proven their loyalty. You know, Gideon said finally, most people couldn't have done what you did. Cut off their entire family. Start over completely. Most people are weak, David replied. They let sentiment cloud judgment. And you don't miss them at all? 19 years of marriage. Raising Lennon from birth. David looked at him, expression unreadable. Would you miss a cancer after it was removed? Gideon shook his head, impressed and perhaps a little disturbed. Still no forgiveness? David lifted his glass, the fading sunlight catching in the crystal. Forgiveness is for the weak.